We live in a CSI-obsessed culture. CSI, in all of its versions, has a dedicated group of crime scene investigators. They are combing the crime scenes to find evidence that will solve the case, right? Forensic proof for their theory of who done it and how. We are so obsessed with shows like this that people now point to what is referred to as the CSI syndrome. Have you heard of it? Jurors in criminal cases are demanding concrete forensic evidence in criminal trials. They want proof that they can see and understand. They want to know for certain because of this proof. Our culture has a CSI syndrome attitude when it comes to God as well. We want concrete evidence of God's existence in the world, proof that we can see and understand. Give me the data so I can measure it and know it. We want to know for certain that God exists. Which leads us to the question we're going to talk about this morning, a question asked in the skeptical age. How can I believe in a God I cannot prove? When we talk about the spectrum of belief in God, there are three basic categories. Maybe you already know them. There's theism, the belief in any God; atheism, the belief that no God exists; and agnostic, which is the refusal to choose between theism and atheism, this sort of I'm not sure kind of response. So let's talk about what we mean by God. To do that, it is sometimes easier to look at what no God might look like. If we are talking about there being no God, we mean that nothing exists outside of the material world we experience, that everything that exists is the consequence of chance and randomness, that everything in the universe can be explained by the material world and the laws of physics that we've come to know. But when we talk about the concept of God, what we mean is that there's this infinite creator and sustainer of all that is and was and will be. God, by nature, is outside of all that has been caused or made into existence. God is outside and beyond and before the created universe. This concept of God is consistent across the religions. Though various religions differ about how God engages in history, they all consistently define their God as beyond and outside and before. When people set out to disprove God, they typically use one of four arguments, and they typically aren't even talking about the same concept of God that we are. The first argument is that science has disproven God. But science deals with what is known and material. God exists outside of the known and the material. So science can't prove or disprove God. The second theory is that God has become irrelevant because we understand the world now, that our knowledge has closed that gap of information for which we would have need for a concept of God at all. And while knowledge might prove how the world works, it does not prove or disprove anything about the creator of that world. And the third third argument is that the difference in understandings of God, what we call theology, among the religions of the world means that there is no God. A careful study of world religions will find much more in common than not. And the differences among religions are about applications of belief. They do not go to the core of religion itself. They do not go to the core understanding of God. And that fourth argument about why there is no God is that the actions of religious people prove there is no God. Do you hear that? That means sometimes that we do a poor job of representing the God in which we believe. But the actions of religious people do not prove or disprove God. Instead, it may prove something about the effectiveness of religion and of its followers. It may prove something about the goodness of us as religious people. But it does not prove or disprove God. Disproving God is difficult. Proving God is equally difficult. 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas tried to do just that. He gave 5 proofs of God that to continue to influence our thinking 700 years later. He never intended that these proofs be the foundation of a person's faith, he gave them to explain the nature of God. And he intended that they build one upon another, that none of them could stand alone, but together they help us understand why God, not as a demonstration of faith or a foundation for our faith, but because God alone is our foundation. So let's look at those. The first of Aquinas's proofs is referred to as the unmoved mover. Something that moves has to be set in motion. Take, for example, a car driving down the road. Something had to start that car in motion. I know my car doesn't just up and leave the garage on its own and go down the road. I and some cool mechanics I don't understand are able to start that car. Creation is the same way. Our world exists and it is moving, and something must have caused that movement. Something before that caused that thing to move, and then there was something before that caused that something to move, and so on. Something had to start the world moving, and it had to be started by something outside of that process. There had to be an unmoved mover who started it all, and we call that God. The second of Aquinas's proofs is referred to as first cause. Something that exists cannot create itself. You cannot give birth to yourself. Someone else must do that. And so my mom gave birth to me, and her mom gave birth to her, and so on, and so on, and so on. This is proof for God that says there must be something that was the first cause of all that exists. And that first cause of all that exists is what we call God. The third of Aquinas's proofs is referred to as contingency. Everything in nature exists or it doesn't exist. Take, for example, a tree. If it exists now, there will come a time when it dies. Then it will no longer exist. And there was a time before there was a tree when it did not exist. There was a time before the universe existed, when nothing existed. If we exist, something had to begin to bring things into existence, and we call that God. These first three proofs, if you will, are what are called theories of infinite regression. In order for a universe with movements, causes, and creations to exist, there must be something that moved others. There must be something that was the first cause. There must be something that was able to create finite beings. And we call that God. The fourth of Aquinas's proofs is referred to as degree. Things can be hot or cold, good or bad. In order to compare things, there must be something against which we can compare them, right? There must be ultimate goodness, ultimate justice, ultimate love. And we call that God. The fifth and last of Aquinas's proofs is referred to as teleological. From the Greek word telos, purpose or goal, sometimes this theory is called watchmaker analogy. Sometimes it's also called intelligent designer. By looking at a watch, you can understand someone designed the watch. Since there is a purpose to this watch, there must be an intelligent designer who created that watch. Now the moon and the stars and humanity appear designed as well. So there must be an intelligent designer, and we call that God. Together, these five arguments or five proofs support a belief that there must be something outside the universe as we know it, causing the world's existence, holding it in motion, serving as a model for love and justice and perfection, leading creation to some grand purpose. And we call that God. There are still other arguments and proofs to demonstrate that faith in God can be rational and intelligent, but faith and wisdom are about more than proof. Hebrews chapter 11 reminds us that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith requires no proof or arguments for it. Faith is being absolutely certain without proof or argument. Faith is being completely convinced without any kind of evidence. Faith sets aside our CSI syndrome and believes. Now, Romans chapter 10, verse 10 helps us understand belief even more. It says, "For one believes with the heart and so is justified, and one confesses with the mouth and so is saved." Our belief in God comes from the heart more than the head. We are made right not because we have been convinced by any kind of evidence. We are made right by our hearts turning toward God, and even when we don't have absolute proof of God. Now, there are times when this kind of faith is hard to come by. Maybe you've experienced that yourself. Times when at the moment we don't believe or find it hard to believe. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist tradition and the Methodist movement, knew a time like this in his own life. He was having a crisis of faith. Even as a leader in the church, he was having a crisis of faith. He wondered about God, about life, about faith. He wasn't sure what to do about this crisis of faith, especially because he was an active pastor at the time. So he confided in his friend, Peter Böhler, a Moravian pastor. It was Böhler who gave him this profound advice. He said to John Wesley, "Preach faith until you have it." That's such really good, beautiful advice. Wesley tried it, and after a time, he heard the message of faith again. His heart was changed. He knew faith and hope again. There is wisdom in living as if there is a God, even if you don't yet believe, even if you don't right now believe. Wisdom comes in living every day so as to put yourself in a position where you can live with hope. Wesley chose to live as if hope was real, and then he discovered that it was. This world is so full of hope and love, more than we humans are capable of on our own. That hope and love comes from a source beyond us, and we call that God. So when your CSI Show Me the Proof non-Christian friend corners you at that social gathering and says to you, "You can't see God. You can't touch God. You can't prove that God even exists. So how can you believe in God?" Well, when that question comes to you, you might say something like this. Proof about God goes both ways. We can't prove that God doesn't exist, just like we can't prove that God does exist. I'm not interested in proving God. I want to live the life that a great and perfect God made possible for me. May you do so. Amen.